The day the knights died, August 26, 1346. On a rain-soaked field near the village of Crécy in northern France, about 9,000 weary English soldiers prepare to face an army more than 3 times their size, 30,000 of Europe as finest warriors. The French hold every advantage: greater numbers, superior armor, and the most celebrated cavalry in Christendom. Their ranks glitter with the cream of European nobility: dukes, counts, and princes mounted on war horses worth fortunes. So certain of victory are they that French lords bicker among themselves over who will earn the glory of slaying the English king. Yet 4 hours later, that confidence lies buried in the mud. 1,500 French nobles, princes, dukes, even kings, are dead. The English, by contrast, have lost only 40 men. Not 400. 40. In one brutal afternoon, 5 centuries of knightly dominance vanish. The age of the armored horseman, the symbol of medieval warfare and noble pride, ends at Crécy, destroyed by peasants armed with bows of yew and hemp strings. The blind king of Bohemia, refusing to be denied the fight, orders his knights to tie their horses to his so he can charge into the fray, straight into death. French knights trample their own allies in blind panic trying to flee. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired at great cost, are butchered by the very nobles who employed them. And for weeks after the slaughter, the crows grow so swollen from feasting on noble flesh that they can no longer fly, only hop between the corpses of kings and knights. This was the Battle of Crécy, the day medieval warfare drowned in the mud. Here, the idea of honor through combat was shattered by common-born archers. Here, the 100 Years' War truly began, with France's most humiliating defeat. By the end of this story, you'll see how a weapon costing barely 10 shillings destroyed armor worth £1,000, why French knights turned on their own mercenaries mid-battle, and how one blind king at his charge became the most tragically noble death in all of military history. Setting, the stage king Edward III of England had just landed on the shores of Normandy, bringing with him around 15,000 men. Through his mother's bloodline, he laid claim to the French throne, and to make his point, he carved a path of fire and ruin across northern France. This campaign was known as a chevauchée, a sanctioned rampage designed not merely for plunder, but to humiliate. It was proof that the French king could not defend his own people. Villages burned, harvests were destroyed, and terrified peasants fled as the English army moved like a storm through the countryside. Edward's men had just sacked Caen and were racing toward the safety of Calais, an English-held port, when the French finally caught up with them. King Philip VI of France had gathered a force unmatched in Europe, a colossal army of 30,000 to 35,000 soldiers, including 12,000 heavy cavalry. These were not mere soldiers, they were the beating heart of French nobility. Every great house had sent its finest: princes, dukes, counts, and lords glittering in armor polished like mirrors. Even kings from distant lands had joined the cause. The Holy Roman Emperor sent troops. The King of Bohemia rode with his entire retinue. Morcar's knights came from across the continent. It was a medieval assembly of Europe's most powerful, a real-life gathering of noble avengers, all united by one shared desire to spill English blood. The French knight was the tank of the Middle Ages. Fully armored from head to toe, mounted on an equally protected war horse, man and beast together weighed close to a ton. These knights had been bred for battle, trained to fight since boyhood. Their armor alone could cost more than a village's annual income, and for 5 centuries their charge had been the unstoppable hammer of European warfare. Infantry existed to be trampled. Archers were a nuisance. Real men, noble men, fought with lances and swords on horseback. Edward III knew this. He also knew he was hopelessly outnumbered, his troops exhausted from weeks of marching and raiding, and dangerously low on supplies. But he had one thing the French dismissed as worthless: 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen, commoners, criminals, and peasants who had been training with their bows since childhood. English law demanded it. Every Sunday, after church, every able-bodied man was required to practice archery. Competing sports were banned if they took time away from the bow. Their weapon was nothing elaborate. A 6-foot staff of yew wood, simple, elegant, and deadly in skilled hands. A trained longbowman could loose 12 arrows a minute and hit a target more than 250 yards away, the length of 2.5 football fields. The bow's draw weight, often 150 to 180 pounds, was so immense that archaeologists can still identify longbow archers by their skeletons, their left arms lengthened and twisted from a lifetime of pulling that brutal string. As the French army closed in, Edward took position on a hill near Crécy, forcing his enemies to attack uphill. He arranged his men into 3 divisions, placing his archers in a V-shaped formation, their fields of fire overlapping like a net of death. Then, in a decision that stunned both armies, he ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot, side by side with common soldiers. It was unthinkable. Nobles fighting like peasants went against everything knighthood stood for. Yet Edward understood something the French could not. The age of the mounted knight was ending. His nobles hesitated. These were men born to charge, their war horses worth their weight in gold. To fight on foot felt like an insult to centuries of tradition. But Edward pressed them, reminding his knights that pride was worthless if it got them all killed. And so, one by one, the proudest men in England stepped down into the mud beside archers in wool hoods, a sight the Christian world had never seen before. That night, the English camp was eerily calm. Archers rubbed beeswax into their bowstrings to keep them dry. Stakes were hammered into the ground, trenches dug by torchlight. Chroniclers even recorded that Edward ordered meat and ale distributed, letting his men sleep on full stomachs, while the French army, still marching, went hungry into the night. Every small detail reflected the same truth: discipline versus arrogance. The English prepared the ground like engineers of death, digging pits and ditches to snare cavalry, angling sharpened stakes to pierce charging horses. By dawn, the muddy hillside had become a trap, and then they waited. Meanwhile, across the field, the French army looked more like a parade than a fighting force. Banners waved, trumpets blared, nobles gleamed in the morning sun, showing off their armor, their pride as bright as their metal. Counts and dukes bickered over who would lead the charge, who would capture the English king, who would earn the greatest glory. The air buzzed with boasting and laughter, not strategy. To the French, this was not a battle. It was a tournament of honor. The morning of battle dawn broke over Crécy beneath a heavy sky. A damp mist clung to the earth, curling over the trenches and stakes the English had set through the night. In the distance, the French banners shimmered faintly in the pale light. Hundreds of silken flags bearing lions, lilies, and crosses fluttering in the soft wind like a restless sea of color. The day began with an omen. A sudden downpour swept across the fields, drenching both armies. The English calmly unstrung their longbows to protect them from the moisture. The French crossbowmen, mercenaries from Genoa, were not so lucky. Their strings were made of twisted sinew, far more vulnerable to rain than the English hemp. Once soaked, they lost their tension and power. As the rain passed, the English bowmen restrung their bows with practiced ease, rubbing waxed tallow along the cords. The French, meanwhile, were forced to wait helplessly, unable to dry their strings before the signal to attack. Around midday, the French army finally arrived at Crécy, hungry, exhausted, and disorganized. They had been marching since dawn in full armor, under the summer sun that now beat down through the clearing clouds. The road behind them was jammed with supply carts, horses, and men jostling for space, but their commanders refused to rest. The French nobles demanded battle at once, unwilling to let the English escape. King Philip VI hesitated. He saw the exhaustion in his men, the confusion in the ranks, the tangled columns that stretched for miles. He suggested they camp and fight the next day after reorganizing, but the lords of France, proud, impatient, and already tasting glory, would not listen. "The English are trapped," they said. "If we wait, they will slip away. Attack now." The French army swelled with tension and arrogance. Trumpets sounded, drums rolled, knights tugged impatiently at their reins, horses snorting and stamping in the mud. The king of Bohemia, blind and aged, sat mounted with his retainers around him, listening to the clamor with silent pride. Before the knights could charge, the Genoese crossbowmen were ordered to advance. They marched forward, forming ranks across the soggy ground, their heavy crossbows glinting under the clouded sun. Their orders were simple: soften the English lines before the cavalry's assault. But they were at a hopeless disadvantage. Their strings were still damp, their pavis shields left behind with the supply wagons far to the rear, and between them and the English stood a slope freshly churned with mud and ditches. The Genoese raised their crossbows and fired. The bolts clattered harmlessly against the English shields, falling short. Then came the reply. From the hillside erupted a sound like ripping cloth and thunder, the English longbowmen loosing in perfect unison. Thousands of arrows darkened the air, descending in great arcs that hissed like rain. The Genoese lines broke almost instantly. Men screamed and dropped their weapons, turning to flee. And that was when disaster struck. The French knights behind them, seeing the mercenaries' retreat, mistook it for cowardice. Enraged, the nobles spurred their horses forward, trampling their own crossbowmen under iron hooves. The screams of crushed men filled the air as the mounted lords surged ahead, banners snapping in the wind, charging uphill toward the waiting English. The first wave was chaos, the ground uneven, their horses slipping in the mud, blinded by arrows and smoke. The English archers kept firing, volleys falling with mechanical precision. Arrows pierced through joints in armor, through visors, through the throats of horses. Those who reached the English lines found trenches and hidden pits waiting for them. Horses stumbled, crashed, and threw their riders into the stakes. One after another, knights tumbled into the earth, crushed under their own armored weight. The few who managed to rise found themselves face to face with English men-at-arms, soldiers fighting on foot with axes, swords, and maces. The clash was brutal, personal, and short-lived. The mounted knight, stripped of momentum and blinded by panic, could do little against the grounded English formations. All the while, the longbows never ceased. Arrow after arrow streaked through the air, cutting down man and beast alike. The field turned slick with blood and churned soil. Yet still, more French cavalry charged forward. Wave after wave, urged on by pride, by fury, by the belief that nobility alone could not fail. Behind them, King Philip watched the slaughter unfold from a distance, horrified and powerless to stop it. His banners advanced, fell, and vanished into the storm of arrows. And through it all, the English king sat on horseback atop the hill, calm and silent, watching. When messengers came asking if he should send reinforcements to his son, the 16-year-old Prince of Wales who commanded one of the flanks, Edward simply asked, "Is he dead or wounded?" "No, my lord." "Then let him earn his spurs." The prince would survive the day. Many of France's greatest lords would not. The fall of the nobility. As the afternoon waned, the fields of Crécy had become a graveyard. The thunder of hooves had faded to the cries of the dying and the hiss of arrows landing among the fallen. The flower of French chivalry, men whose names had filled chronicles and songs, now lay scattered in mud and blood. Yet the pride of France refused to die quietly. Each new wave of knights, unaware of the slaughter ahead, galloped into the storm of arrows. The valley between the armies was now so choked with corpses and wrecked horses that fresh attackers had to ride over the dead to reach the English lines. The English longbowmen, trained to pace their volleys, fired methodically, not in rage, but with the cold precision of craftsmen. They knew the rhythm of death. Draw, aim, loose, draw, aim, loose. From the hilltop, King Edward III watched as his son, the young Prince of Wales, stood firm amid the chaos. His armor was darkened by smoke and mud, and it was here that he earned his famous name, the Black Prince. He fought not from horseback, but on foot among his men, a prince of royal blood fighting as a common soldier. The sight would become legend across Europe, the heir to England as throne standing shoulder to shoulder with archers and infantry, surrounded by the bodies of knights far older and more renowned than himself. But the most haunting moment of Crécy was yet to come. Far to the French right, the King of Bohemia, John of Luxembourg, an aging monarch blinded by illness, listened to the din of battle from his tent. Though he could not see the field, he could hear the panic and the retreat. He knew his allies were being destroyed. Turning to his attendants, he said softly, "Gentlemen, you are my friends and companions. Lead me so far into this fight that I may strike one blow with my sword." His knights tied their horses' bridles together and to their King S, so that he could be guided into battle. Then, as one, they spurred forward. The charge of the blind king cut through the chaos like a final act of doomed honor. Arrows rained down, horses screamed, and yet they pressed on until they reached the English line. There, surrounded and outnumbered, the Bohemian king and his loyal followers fell together, their horses still bound. When the fighting finally ceased, the English found their bodies tied together by their reins, all dead where they stood. On the king's crest, Edward III later ordered written in Bohemia's honor, "Ich dien," I serve. It would become the motto of the Prince of Wales, still used by his successors today. By nightfall, the battlefield was silent save for the moans of the wounded and the circling of crows. The French army had been annihilated. Among the dead were the King of Bohemia, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Flanders, and 1,500 knights, the very core of French nobility. Whole families of the old chivalric order had been wiped from existence in a single day. The English lost fewer than 50 men. For hours after the battle, Edward forbade his soldiers from looting or celebrating. Instead, they gathered torches and searched the field for survivors, many of whom were too badly wounded to move. Chroniclers wrote that the English buried the dead in great heaps, and for weeks afterward, the air was thick with the stench of decay. The chronicler, Jean Froissart, would later describe the aftermath in words that still chill the soul. The crows grew so fat upon the flesh of nobles that they could no longer fly. The Battle of Crécy was not merely a victory, it was a turning point in the very nature of war. For the first time in centuries, common men with simple weapons had destroyed the might of Europe's nobility. The bow had humbled the sword. The age of the mounted knight, that shining symbol of feudal honor, was over. From that muddy hillside in northern France, a new kind of warfare was born. One ruled not by birth or title, but by discipline, strategy, and skill. The end of chivalry. In the quiet after Crécy, a strange stillness fell over northern France. What had begun as a proud display of knightly valor had ended in the mud, beneath clouds of smoke and the wings of crows. The names once spoken with reverence, lords, counts, dukes, and princes, were now reduced to lists of the dead. The French nobility had charged again and again into the storm of arrows, unable to believe that centuries of honor could be undone by common hands. But it was undone, completely. The Battle of Crécy marked the death of an era. The shining code of chivalry, born in the tournaments of medieval Europe, had met the cold, unromantic precision of the longbow. The battlefield was no longer a place for honor, but for efficiency. King Edward III understood that truth better than any man alive. When the battle ended, he did not gloat. He did not stage triumphs or parades. Instead, he gave thanks, quietly, and then turned his attention northward to the sea. Within months, his army laid siege to the French port of Calais, starving the city into surrender after nearly a year. The victory gave England a foothold in France that would last for 2 centuries, a beachhead from which future kings would wage endless war. But even as England celebrated, the deeper meaning of Crécy lingered, a whisper of change carried through every court in Europe. It was no longer enough to be born noble. No amount of armor, no weight of gold, no ancient lineage could protect a man from the reach of a well-drawn bow. Across Europe, military minds took note. The Swiss pikemen, the Flemish militias, and later the English archers would prove that disciplined common soldiers could break any noble charge. The armored knight, once a symbol of unstoppable might, became an obsolete relic of pride. And yet, there was something hauntingly beautiful about that ending. The fall of an ideal, not in shame, but in inevitability. Crécy was not simply a battle between England and France. It was a collision between two worlds, the old, ruled by lineage and glory, and the new, shaped by innovation and grit. On that field, the Middle Ages began to crumble, and the first shadows of the Renaissance, of thought, technology, and realism, began to stir. When chroniclers wrote of Crécy, they did not call it glorious. They called it strange, terrible, and unforgettable. A day when a blind king charged into death for honor, and peasants with wooden bows changed the destiny of nations. The crows of Crécy would fly over Europe for generations, not in feather and claw, but in the echoes of every battle that followed. For at Crécy the world learned a simple, eternal truth. War does not honor the brave. It honors the prepared.